Hi, everybody. I'm David Kirkpatrick of Techonomy, and very happy to be here with you today with our two guests, one of whom has turned on her video. The other I told to turn off her video before, and now she's got to turn it on again. There she is, Michelle. Thank you so much. We're going to talk today about the intersection between business and the environmental movement and the consequences for business of the astonishingly rapid degradation in the climate and our general environment, but particularly climate, which I think all of us have in the very forefront of our minds these days. So let me quickly introduce Elizabeth and Michelle. Elizabeth is a 25-year veteran of EDF. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's a long time. You don't look that old. But anyway,
Thank you.
She runs something called EDF+Business, and I'm going to ask her to explain what that means in a minute, but it's pretty meaningful. And Microsoft is a big partner of EDF, and Michelle and Elizabeth have been working closely together for the last couple of years. Michelle is chief of staff to the head of sustainability at Microsoft, which is now, is it Elizabeth Brinton? Is that her name?
That's our CVP of sustainability, and we just unfortunately lost Dr. Lucas Joppa, our chief environmental officer. So we have twin bookends of our operational and commercial strategy.
Did you have the same role with Lucas?
I did. If you like it, you might as well do it twice.
Well, Lucas is fantastic. He spoke at our Techonomy Climate Conference and was a superstar there. So I don't want to talk much before we get started, but I do think it's a really appropriate topic we've found today on why environmentalists need to work with business. There is still some dispute over that topic, it seems, although not at EDF, which is a group that I've been privileged to know about for many years. I wrote an article in Fortune where I interviewed Fred Krupp, I think it was in '88. And it was a cover story, and it had the CEO of PG&E on the cover, which was kind of maybe good at the time, but I don't know if we would have done that in the interim. But in any case, I guess one or two quick things. Like this weather we're all having, no matter where you live. I think it was 110 in Palo Alto yesterday. The Rhine, the Yangtze, the Colorado rivers are all at shockingly low historic levels because of drought. Even the Hudson Valley, where I live, has been in a pretty serious drought recently until we had a deluge the last couple of days. And that's what happens, like in Dallas a couple of weeks ago, where they had so much drought that the ground was like adobe. Then they had 8 inches of rain in one day, and it all just washed off and caused huge flooding. So we're in a feast or famine situation, and it is not good. It's generally famine, literally and figuratively, especially in Pakistan right now. It's a terrible situation there. If you've been reading about that, one of many places being battered by climate disasters. So I just want to mention those things as background, because this is not a minor topic we're discussing here. This is existential for all of us. And I think what you're going to find today in our discussion is that a lot of businesses are starting to recognize how existential it is. And that's a tremendously positive development. There's a lot of positive things that have happened in terms of awareness recently, and we just have to hope that they translate into action. And with that brief intro, I'd like Elizabeth to just start to talk a little bit about why EDF works so closely with business and what her job as head of EDF+Business really involves. And then I want to go into depth with what Microsoft is doing through Michelle. So Elizabeth, it's all yours.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to have this conversation with my very best buddy, Michelle. I'm very much looking forward to this. A good conversation, I'm sure. I'll start by giving a little bit of history about EDF. And I'm proud to say that EDF figured out, I think before any other environmental group, that it is necessary to work with business. And that's Fred Krupp, and due to him and his vision, he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called The Fourth Wave of Environmentalism, which was all about unlikely partnerships. And, EDF came into existence in the 1960s when many other environmental groups also were created. I'll note that it was during the time when we had a Republican president, Richard Nixon, creating the EPA, and the use of laws were how you got things done. You used legal mechanisms, you use legal enforcement to get environmental progress. And we did so, EDF did, by banning DDT, actually. And our informal motto at the time was "sue the bastards." So it's changed a lot since then. Our formal motto now is finding the ways that work. And that's really about it all, right? Like, we have to find the ways that work. And I just think there was this realization that the economy and business are important, and they are creating products that we all need, and they are the engine of progress. And so we've got to find a way to create that win-win. Win for business, win for the environment. I will say that when I started out, that was not to be taken for granted, and companies were really wary. My first partnership with UPS, I remember calling them up, and he said he thought 60 Minutes was calling, and it was the first time an environmental group had ever been on their campus. And so it just was a whole different time. And now I think we've found that win-win is absolutely true. That doesn't mean that it doesn't cost a lot to address environmental challenges, but the fact is that is the only path forward. And so, there's a lot of opportunity and great business benefits for being environmentally progressive. It's cost savings, it's increased market share, new product development, customer retention, employee engagement, you name it, and PR. So there's just all sorts of benefits. And the reality is there is no other path forward. We need a stable climate to exist. So better get on board. Maybe I'll stop there, David. You are muted.
Sorry. Of course I was. Talk before we turn it over to Michelle. Talk a little more specifically about what exactly EDF+Business does on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, thanks so much. So EDF+Business really works directly with business to create environmental change. And it's through signature partnerships with leading companies that have a lot of leverage in the world, like Walmart, a partnership that I led for more than 10 years and still work with. And those partnerships can show the way, they can prove the win-win. Business itself has immense power to drive change. For example, if Walmart says it wants a certain kind of product, that drives that demand signal throughout the supply chain. We work together and partner with companies like Microsoft. Michelle and I helped create something called the Transform to Net Zero group with EDF, Microsoft, and now 9 other companies with BSR as the secretariat, which is really all about leading companies, those leading companies who have net zero goals, trying to figure out how to get to net zero, sharing that journey, sharing the learnings, the failures, how to do it with other companies so that they can fast follow. And also trying to do some of the systems change work like policy and finance to bring everyone along. And so that's what EDF+Business is all about, is figuring out how to make the most of the ambition loop. So our piece being voluntary corporate action, showing the way, their leadership, driving policy change, driving finance, creating a real ambition loop between the public and private sector to really address the climate crisis.
I am muted again. One of the things you would be involved in then would be helping companies figure out more effective ways to advocate for policy in it, among many other things. Is that, so in order to tie the government piece in, is that part of what you do? And just quickly.
Yes, that's right. And we created something called the AAA framework, which really makes it very simple and easy. Simple, I should say, maybe not easy, but really important. And that is the three A's are advocate, align, and allocate. And so advocate is companies must engage directly in policy advocacy. The allocate is they need to put their dollars towards trying to help solve the climate crisis by and they're lobbying dollars to do so. And then align is really bringing along the trade groups, which we've seen is a real Achilles heel, I think, on policy advocacy. It's a real big challenge, but would be remiss in saying that we are super, super appreciative for those companies like Microsoft who really stepped up with the Inflation Reduction Act and advocated and pushed that hard to make that happen. And that has really changed the game in the United States. That public sector help in the investment in infrastructure and our leadership in the world, it is a game changer. And so companies absolutely must engage in the policy advocacy piece. And that's been, something where that's been a hard battle.
Thank you. And I have my mic on now. Yeah, the IRA, I think most of the people here don't think of it as the Inflation Reduction Act. We think of it as the Climate Act, because that's really what it was for us. Michelle, take it anywhere you want, but tell us what Microsoft is doing, the degree of its commitment, how you do your work, and how you think about partnering with EDF and environmentalists generally.
Yeah, and I think as I look at the title of this, I think about it as why business needs to work with environmentalists. I think it very much needs to go both ways. And I think that shift that you're starting to see from companies in not just engaging, but really embracing various environmental movements is, I think, very much tied to the wave of consciousness that's really rippling through corporate America about, as you look to sustainability, we're seeing this evolution away from sort of a niche CSR issue and mostly as a need to comply, which has a very different opportunity cost and very different dollars attached to it, to a business opportunity, to a business transformation opportunity for all of the reasons that Elizabeth outlined. At Microsoft, we certainly have seen all of those be equally true. We've been in sustainability for a long time. I think most companies that have been around like to say that. We started our first carbon emissions target in 2009, and then in 2012, set out a commitment to become carbon neutral across our basically operational footprint across scopes 1, 2, and our business travel. And we managed to meet that commitment every year from 2012 until 2020, where we decided to go a little bit beyond that. And in 2020, I think we were sort of surfing the front wave of that transformation. We were really looking at competitors doing more on sustainability and it becoming a product and a brand differentiator in terms of sales. We were looking at the growth of the Greta movement for short around that period of time, with Extinction Rebellion and employee engagement really hitting an all-time high. Microsoft, fun fact, had just purchased the property in which Extinction Rebellion in London finished all of their rallies, so it became very existential to us very quickly. It was really literally on our front door. And then the third thing that we saw around that time frame too was just the warning signals from the planet were sort of at an all-time high. And as a data-driven company, that 2019 IPCC report that said despite Paris, we have actually made no progress on global emissions and they're going up, was really an eye-opener for us. And so that took us from this kind of neutral is not enough standpoint. So in 2020, we set commitments to become carbon negative, so to actually remove more carbon from the atmosphere than we put out by 2030, and to actually go a step beyond that to start to get into questions of equity, which immediately come up when it comes to talking about climate change. We pledged to also remove all of our historical emissions by 2050. Right after that, we followed with a commitment to become water positive, to become zero waste, and then to really put the power of our technology to work for the planet with our ecosystems commitment. So big commitments, pretty sweeping across the board for us. I know a lot of people look at technology companies and our emissions are definitely smaller than some other folks, but 16 million metric tons of carbon is nothing to sneeze at. And so we have a very large task ahead of us as we really look at how do we achieve that? And we're looking first at efficiency. How can we continue to improve? That's got to be where every company starts. But we know that efficiency alone isn't going to be able to get us from 16 million to zero. So we're looking at renewable energy, looking at carbon removal, and looking at alternative fuels like sustainable aviation fuel. And our hope is that through our ambition, not only do we make Microsoft better, but our bet is so big that we're going to have to drag markets with us to get to that change. For us to zero out our business airline travel, we need enough sustainable aviation fuel for every Microsoft employee to be covered in the world. For us to remove historical emissions, we're going to be purchasing, somewhere north of 6 million metric tons of carbon removal by 2030. That makes us a really big player in really small markets. And we hope that through that kind of commitment that are really spurred on by both the science and pressure from environmental groups and from regulators, that companies can start to set those ambitions that change themselves, but really have the pathway to change the rest of the world.
And of course, Microsoft is really making a business out of carbon reduction for clients and really being quite innovative in that, taking things you've learned in your own operations and applying them in other companies, right? That's fairly significant movement too.
That's right. And we're doing that from things that people probably don't notice, like a carbon aware screen on Windows. So just like you can plan your Windows update for a time that doesn't disrupt the middle of a panel or something else, you can also set that based on carbon awareness of the grids, all the way down to actually packaged services that we are selling now to customers, things like the Microsoft Sustainability Manager, which are getting at that data problem. One of the first things that we hear from our customers is that they've set big commitments and then everybody has to figure out, well, are we making any progress against them? How do we get better forecasting? It is a dirty fact that nobody wants to talk about, but most sustainability reporting is done well after the fiscal year is closed. So you don't have the ability to use that information to actually course correct. And the more that sustainability data becomes publicly reportable and publicly auditable in the same way financial information is, that's going to have to change pretty rapidly with the EU regulations coming in on CSRD and the SEC regulations. Sustainability data will need to be collected on a quarterly basis and be able to use by both companies and by investors as a signal of companies' progress. And that means that there is a big business there to clean up that data estate. Sustainability data is essentially the entire data estate of a company. And we treat it like, I don't even think it's probably a lower class citizen at this point. It is a afterthought. So there's a lot of work to be done to pull that together. And then to make sure that that's actually information that is useful and usable by companies.
Really cool. And I should have said at the outset that this session is part of the lead up to our conference on Tuesday, September 20th, which is 2 weeks from yesterday here in New York, which we're calling the Health and Wealth of Our Planet. And we're very pleased that Elizabeth will be a panelist there. Michelle, that will get her in another conference very soon, we hope. So you're all invited to come to that. We really hope you will make it. The registration information, maybe one of, oh, thank you. Kendall, who's listed as Claire Media, which is our owner. She's got the registration information there in the chat. So, and in part of prepping for that, Caitlin Hamilton, who was on the call also, who's my colleague in programming this event, and I were just having a call this morning with Heather Johnson, who's head of sustainability at Ericsson and is going to be speaking. And one of the things she was saying was that at Ericsson, and I imagine a similar mindset may prevail at Microsoft, although it's harder for Microsoft. Ericsson has this view that to really do scope 3 properly, they have to ensure that all of their products that they have sold to customers are being operated in a net zero fashion. And that kind of ecosystem mindset is, to me, very exciting, because the more companies start thinking along those lines, the more it creates a movement that really is collective and to some extent unstoppable. And I don't know if any of you want to jump in and comment on that. If you do, feel free. I also would like maybe Elizabeth to describe this Transform to Net Zero coalition that you two were very seminal in getting started, and talk about it in a little more detail. You did mention it earlier, but so either one of you say anything.
I'll jump in a little bit and say, that, this is so energizing and exciting when I hear Erickson say that, right? That is where we need to go. I think the reality is that we need to start way back here for most companies, right? Very few companies are like Ericsson or Microsoft. What the heck is scope 3, right? Like, so your scopes of your emissions are, your scope 1 is your direct emissions, the company's direct emissions. Scope 2 is generally purchased electricity. And scope 3 is kind of everything else. And it ends up being emissions in your supply chain and products upstream, means emissions downstream for your customers. It means the use of the products, the life cycle emissions and their use, those kinds of things, airline travel that Michelle mentioned. So it's very, very challenging to get at. So where we need to start for most companies is really looking down, yes, look ahead and see where we need to get, right? So we know, as you both alluded to, we're kind of behind the curve here, right? We realize, like Michelle mentioned the IPCC report, it's like, oh, big wake up call, right? We're behind where we need to be. We need to reduce emissions in this decisive decade by 50%. So that's less than 10 years. And we have been increasing emissions. So when we think about the global pandemic, we reduced emissions by 7%. Well, we basically need to do the same thing without shutting down the global economy. It's kind of that same, that's the challenge here. So it really does mean transforming the economy. So looking ahead, that's where we need to go. For most companies, this is really going to be like, okay, let's try and figure out where, as a company, where's your biggest opportunity to reduce your emissions? A lot of times it really is in your electricity. I want to do a shout out to a series of work that EDF did called Pathways to Net Zero, which was really meant to simplify this ecosystem and try and help companies understand, okay, if I'm in a certain sector, here's what I need to do to prioritize. Michelle's right. We need to get to the point where we're measuring and we're doing a good baseline so that companies understand where their impact is so that they can have a data-driven plan to address their climate risk. The challenge is we need companies to not spend all their time measuring right now, right? Michelle will hopefully solve that problem for us with new data tools, right? New technologies. But right now, it's a lot of people with a lot of spreadsheets and such. And so the message that I really want to give to companies, especially those starting out on this journey, is yes, do the measuring, do the reporting. That's important. You know what? You need to prioritize even more acting now and figuring out what's the most important priority. Michelle, maybe I'll turn it over to you. I mentioned Transform to Net Zero that I'm very proud of creating with you, but maybe you can jump in and explain it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to chime in on that last point too, I think we have a lot of environmental groups to thank for the sort of rising of collective corporate consciousness to be able to speak carbon math. I think, when we set our carbon negative target, we picked negative on purpose. I think climate positive and carbon positive feels a whole lot better coming off the tongue. But if you can explain to a board of an engineering company how a negative integer can somehow be positive, more credit to you than to us. So I think that precision of detail is really kind of another mark of that change, where you didn't just need to be conversant on a call with EDF or with Greenpeace. You really needed to be able to speak climate everywhere all the time. And I think, all three topics we've just mentioned, the sort of push on scope 3 and to really think about the whole of life cycle, that came exactly from environmental movements. Companies started to want to think about positive emissions, but every organization, including ourselves, have been called onto the carpet for some of the incremental and non-intentional impacts of our products, and to really think meaningfully about that as a full scope of that work. The measurement is absolutely something that has come out of the environmental movement as well. And I think, it is not very hard to see some of what EDF, Greenpeace, Sunrise Movement have been calling for in terms of corporate responsibility translated directly into some of the SEC language. So I think it is not always, environmentalism has almost become mainstream at this point, which I think is awesome, because it means that we have that sort of push continuing from our environmental flank, but also being mainstreamed in, and so actually making some progress. But that mainstreaming of progress is really what we're thinking about in Transform to Net Zero. So we were tasked with sort of this idea of accelerating towards net zero, not just as a company, but really how do you move whole ecosystems of companies. And as we looked around, we saw a couple of things. One, there were a lot of sectoral organizations, so a lot of technology companies talking to technology companies about how technology can get better, a lot of energy companies doing the same thing. But that's not how emissions work, and that's not how the global economy works. We're all very much interrelated, and so none of us can solve this problem in a silo, as Erickson had mentioned. All of us at some point hit each other's supply chain, we hit each other's suppliers, and we hit each other's consumption of products. So Elizabeth and I started talking, I was like, well, what if we got together a multi-sectoral group of leaders? So the group didn't spend a lot of time arguing about what leadership looked like, but just said this is, sort of a smaller group that can move at speed, kind of kept to the general rule of team sports, not more than 12. So that was a weird group to pull together and not try to get bigger. But that group is really intended not to put Unilever, Nike, Maersk, Microsoft, and our other members up on a pedestal, but to make it actionable. I think both Elizabeth and her work and us and our conversations with customers saw there are a lot of companies that want to do a lot more, a lot faster than what they're doing. They don't know where to start. If you don't have a game book, if you don't have a playbook on what exactly good or good enough looks like, you end up sort of grabbing at whatever is in front of you and then measuring after the fact. So it all kind of comes back together. And for us, Transform to Net Zero is really about, Elizabeth mentioned that fast follow. I think about it as, can we get to some sort of turbo tax almost for the rest of the company? Is of like, here's your playbook, here's your plan, and here's how to get going. And more importantly, how to take that and get corporate buy-in across the board. I think we have a lot of chief sustainability officers that are incredibly passionate about their work, but we need to translate that talk of sustainability into business value to get folks moving. And so that's what we've been doing through really taking that work out of PR puff piece case studies and into playbooks to get everyone else to move a little bit faster.
This is why we're glad we have Microsoft here, because you actually sound more like an environmentalist than a corporate speak person, which is great. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, that was quite interesting, some of the things Michelle said that the environmental movement has pushed business into doing, and the business actually is doing. But how would you characterize the environmental movement's understanding of how much business has changed? I mean, I know EDF has been studying and working with business throughout its entire history, as you said. But what about, is there a shift happening? Do you think more environmentalists are starting to realize how much business could be their ally? Or is that still to come?
Yes, 100%. And I think we've seen that from, just the years that we have been doing this work. When we started out, we were the only ones who were partnering with companies. And now, Greenpeace is and WWF is, and, really almost every environmental group has realized that working with business is the key to getting some big change done. So that alone, and it's one of those things where, in business, when usually you don't want to see the competitors come, right? But it means that you're doing something right and everyone wants to copy you. And so I take it that way, that EDF figured something out here. And the truth is, we kind of need every single environmental group to engage with companies. They bring different expertise, and the scale of the transformation that's needed is so huge. And so you need specialized expertise on many different sectors, right? Cement and airline travel and trucks and electricity. It's just the scope of the challenge is really, really big. One thing that I think just got put in the chat that I wanted to do a shout out from that Michelle mentioned, Transform to Net Zero. was these transformation guides that we created as, and they're really meant to just be really easy tools for companies who are just trying to figure out some of the basics of, how to do policy engagement, how to set a net zero goal, things like that. It's, the net zero goal setting, climate transition action plans, climate justice, many other topics. So not to say that these are the only tools that are out there, but they're, I think, very actionable, and they really are easy to follow and can get companies going.
I'm very, encouraged, heartened really by the optimism you both have about businesses' willingness to do the right thing. However, when you include something like climate justice in that list you just put in there, I frankly am certain that most companies aren't thinking in those terms yet. And to be honest, I want to just elaborate briefly on something I think you said earlier, Elizabeth, about the world has to cut its carbon emissions, its climate gas, greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. By what year is it, by the way? Is it 2030, 2050, 2040? 2030?
2030, correct.
Pretty damn soon. Anyway, it's not just that. It's that we still live in a world where 2/3 of it is basically aspiring to have a better lifestyle and a middle-class life. And they're not going to be denied that. They cannot be. It's not fair for us rich people to expect them not to want to live the way we do. And yet so they have to grow those economies and grow those standards of living radically in that same period in order for justice at the macro level to prevail, right? So we have to figure out how all those people can have the kinds of, and interestingly, I was at a Council on Foreign Relations event yesterday where Alice Hill was speaking, who's really knowledgeable there, and I'm sure you sounds like you know her. And one of the things somebody was saying, it asked her a question actually, and her answer was not too satisfying, but they made the point that, what we really are going to need, and this is slightly off topic, but I apologize. What we're really going to need is for the developing world to leapfrog technologically in the same way that it did with mobile phones. And is there a prospect, this member of the council was asking Alice, that we could see that with climate tech, that in fact the developing countries might be earlier? And of course, you're nodding, Michelle. I want you to talk about this because Michelle is so amazingly global. I mean, you guys are in every country. I wrote a giant piece about Microsoft in China at one point. I mean, I remember one of the things was in that story, I don't know if I made it in the story, that because the leaders in the standing committee all used Microsoft products, they were involved in thinking about what it ought to, and many of them were, in fact, bootleg, but they were still using them even at the standing committee level. This is 20 years ago. But anyway, you're global. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that is, I think we often think about what our sort of spheres of influence are, and that sort of belies the fact that we are a company that operates sort of like a country in the global economy, given how big we are. But we really think about those spheres of influence in terms of, we have employees in every country that we need to recruit, retain. Really hard to recruit and retain employees if you don't have access to education, if you don't have access to healthcare, if you are consistently being bombarded, feast, famine, deluge, monsoon, et cetera, sort of name your favorite weather pattern at the moment. So we think about what are the people that are going to be doing this work and people that work for us. We also think about the ecosystems around us, sort of the developers that are using our technologies or that we would like to use our technologies. And we think about how we do that work with governments too across those spheres of influence. And so, I think there is, it is not a given that climate tech can be a leapfrog opportunity. There is a lot of infrastructure work that needs to happen that is foundational. I think we are somewhat optimistic about that because we've been doing that work for quite some time. And so have other technology companies, and doing everything from laying fiber to figuring out how to get Wi-Fi. It's good for our business, but it also means that we're bringing along cloud, and it just happens in a lot of those places. access to a Wi-Fi or a fiber connection is pretty much non-existent. So there have been a lot of dual use solar deployments along with clean electricity that also come along with cloud centers that have been deployed across Africa and Latin America. And we're really taking a look now across the tech ecosystem of where can we take and really start to bring up the level of entrepreneurship? How can we get more awareness to the work that's already being done? And how do we deploy capital against that? I think that's what we know needs to happen. And a lot of that is work I think we're optimistic to see showcased at COP27 this year. It's in Egypt. It's the first non-European COP that we've had in quite some time. And the focus from the Egyptian government and really all of the African Union is exactly on this question of how do you bring foreign direct investment, not necessarily in resilience, but really in building the foundational structures of new economies into that work. You'll see a lot of companies like Microsoft making efforts and investments in both that skilling side, but then also really pairing that together with the financial side. So we both purchase carbon removal. We're really interested in what that looks like from startup companies in India. There are several that we're starting to work with in Africa as well. But I think the trick will be how do you get the green premium down right now? And I think that is, we can solve infrastructure. We know how to do that. How to rapidly drop the price to get that hockey stick curve down to allow adoption, I think is going to be the biggest hindrance that we've got to climate tech. So we need to enable those local ecosystems to be able to fill that gap. But in the near term, companies like us have a big opportunity, I think, to make room for climate tech by bringing down that green premium for everybody else. Brad said it in our initial blog post of those that have more can do more and should do more. And this is one of those places where big companies kind of taking that green premium on now, so it lowers the cost for others in the future, is sort of an interesting way to look at corporate philanthropy that's also good for us in the near term.
We have a provocative question about degrowth that we're going to get to in a minute, but you know, Elizabeth, I'd love you to, you know, one of the things about Microsoft that you have to concede is they have extraordinary profitability. So it gives them a lot more latitude in some of these areas. Like even if, okay, I actually, I think it was on the prep call that Michelle was saying that Microsoft put in an internal price for carbon, what was it, in 2012 or 2014? And, you know, and in order to fund corporate initiatives, but they could do that because all the business units make a lot of money and they could, you know, but for companies that maybe don't feel quite as flush as Microsoft, I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit, Elizabeth, about how they should think about the business opportunity side of this, and or what else could and should motivate them when they're going to have inevitably, you know, maybe people in the baby boom like myself kind of grumbling in the board or wherever, you know, this is not the time for our company to take responsibility for the world.
It is, but to say it that way, I mean, that is the truth of things. But I get what you're saying, David. And I know that, you know, the short term, the narrow challenge here is to get companies on a different path, get every company on a different path. The reality is you don't have to talk about it as climate at all. You really don't, or environment. It doesn't matter. This is good business. This is good business. And the other fact of the matter is there's a lot of, you know, really basic efficiency opportunities and cost saving opportunities. Michelle made the point, we're not going to get where we need to go by efficiency alone. But when you look at the data and the analyses, you see how far we get with that, and that's a long way. So start there, start that positive feedback loop of building the momentum for action, and call it whatever you call it, right? Call it about being, you know, a focus on quality and efficiency and effectiveness as a business. And like, this is a no-brainer. This should be, you know, easy to sell anywhere in the country and the world. There is no other path forward, so we have to figure that out. And you know, it's becoming, I think, a license to operate issue too. If you don't as a company start to engage and figure this out, you will be forced to, right? It's much better to kind of do the thinking and figure it out strategically as to how you win in this new economy, right? And how you help your workers make a transition. You know, how you really change what you're doing. You know, I guess I feel like so often I'm lucky to get to work with people like Michelle, who are like really on the leading edge and thinking so far ahead and thinking big, and it's so energizing. But the other push for me, like personally, is I've got a 15-year-old daughter who's now been vegetarian for 5 years and just decided she's going zero waste, which means for her means zero plastic. Do you know how hard that is, David? It's really hard. And it is like opened my eyes to the fact of, you know, how often I use like a plastic fork that will last for 1,000 years, right? But it's, you know, meant to be used once. That is just illogical, right? That can't continue, right? So it is really about like changing our mindsets, and the, you know, young people, our future, the kids, like they're demanding a different path. You know, Michelle's got one too, and I'm sure they just have a different mindset.
It's true. And I do think my personal view is that the employee hiring and retention issue is one of the number one, if not the number one thing pushing a lot of big companies towards realizing they have to at least seem to be moving in this direction, or they're not going to be able to hire smart young people. I also just happen to notice there's at least one millennial on this call, this Zoom, who has told me that she does not want to have children because of the world we're in. And that is pretty tragic. I mean, and when you talk about illogical things that have, I mean, there's so many illogical things that have to end that are not ending. That to me, I just worry about too much optimism here, frankly. But okay, with that said, I'd love both of you to talk a little more about the zeitgeist shift, because this new government movement we've seen finally in the US, and we kind of reasserted our ability to take a global position on this, and countries finally have to listen to us again after the IRA has passed, because they were saying, don't tell us to reduce carbon, you guys aren't doing anything, you know. But I'd love both of you to just give your opinion. And I think you've already sort of sounded optimistic about this, but I'm not, frankly, as optimistic about how much businesses en masse, particularly in the United States, are really getting the memo that things have fundamentally changed.
Yeah, I can start because we just started looking at this question with Deloitte from a data perspective. And I think what we've seen even just there, I think is pretty telling.
Another partner of ours, by the way, Deloitte, speaking at our conference. We love Deloitte.
And Microsoft. In 2020, their CXO survey found that it was something around like about half of CEOs thought that climate change was an existential threat to their business, not to the planet, but to their business.
Half.
2021, that hit 79% of the top executives. That is a 20%, almost a 30% jump in a year. And I think that
never see that in polling.
No, almost never. And I think what we can take away from that is a couple of things. One is that there are external pressures that are pushing that. We've talked about public reporting, we've talked about environmental pressure, we've talked about employees. But I think the other thing that they've seen is just the business impacts. And for me, I think it all comes back to that, is businesses are empathetic. They are part of an ecosystem, but the thing that really moves businesses is business value. And when you start to threaten business value at the way that it's been threatened in the past 2 years with the weather that you mentioned, David, there is almost not a company in the world. And in fact, I think BlackRock took a look at it. It was like 92% of like the S&P 500 said that already their business has been disrupted in a materially and financially impactful way in the past 2 years due to climate change. So I think, we like to sometimes say never waste a good crisis. This is about as good of a crisis as we're going to get as a planet, and for businesses to really optimize and start to do work around.
Okay, good. At the risk of going into a really weird minefield, I've just allowed Jay Frank to talk, who asked a question about degrowth. Ask your question. I mean, I think you should say whatever you want to say.
Well, thank you, David.
Identify yourself too, please.
Hi, my name is Jay Frank from the Lower East Side of Manhattan Island. I am definitely looking forward to the conference and hopefully shaking hands with David. I'm a huge admirer of the work that all of you are doing.
Thank you.
I am aware of a movement that seems to be very much provocative to capitalism as it stands and American capitalism, and that is degrowth. And it seems to be a movement that speaks to a lot of the questions of the systematic breakdowns that you guys are talking about in the outputs of environmental existential crisis.
Yeah.
So degrowth, is degrowth on the roadmap with you guys?
It's hard for companies to have degrowth on the roadmap, but I'd love to hear you both comment on that, because there are a lot of people who are saying that is the answer. We got to grow less. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
I think from a math perspective, I think that is the easy answer, and it might be the right answer. I think for businesses, given what I just said about creating business value, I think that's a really tough pill to swallow. And that is why we have looked so much at decoupling growth from emissions. I think that's a pathway we have to go through. I think it is incredibly hard, and we do not know the answer to what that pathway looks like yet. And I'll just be, candid too. I think Microsoft took this head on this year as, 2 years into our commitments. We actually saw our scope 3 emissions go up about 20%. And that is entirely due to our growth of products and services and the cost of those goods in the past years. So we know that we're not going to hit our targets unless we figure out how to grow within those. I do think it's an interesting question, and the closer we get to 2030, I think the harder people are going to have to look at it. I think this is going to be sort of the next interesting point of tension between environmental groups and businesses about how much do we push the sort of outcomes and the pathways there, because certainly something's got to change. But I think for us, we're still looking pretty hard at what are the options to decouple that growth from emissions.
I'd love to hear anything Elizabeth has to say about this too. And,
Yeah, well, try and go to any boardroom and make that pitch, Jay. Oh, that's really, really hard, right? The fact of the matter is that this is a system, right? And consumption needs to be addressed, right? Like that's the fact, right? When we were first working with Walmart, are you gonna go in and say, you need to just, cut half of your business? It's just that's a failing argument. So really, I think it's a matter of a maybe a multi-pronged approach, right? Where the reality is you need systems change here, right? There are systems drivers that are causing some of the problems that we have, like the short-termism and like quarterly reporting and it not enabling a longer term perspective. There are a lot of drivers to think about profits really narrowly even now. So really trying to put in the systems to enable companies to explicitly take into financial account all of those what you would call externalities, all of those impacts in the world. The more that can happen, the more it just becomes a part of the system and we'll get where we need to go. So I think it's got to be a multi-pronged approach. And I think the reality is we can do so much to create these new systems and, as Michelle said, decouple growth from environmental impact. I think that there are a lot of ways to do the kind of closed loop that we need to see in a way that it does not have negative impact and indeed could create positive impact.
What you just said really strikes me as intriguing. The SEC has proposed some rules that would really start requiring carbon emissions disclosures. And in Europe, that already exists and it's great. But it makes me wonder, does the SEC need to change the nature of their financial disclosure requirements? Because ultimately Wall Street doesn't care about most of what we're discussing. And that is hard. Disagree with me if you want, but the investment community is still extremely bottom line oriented at all costs. And I think some of that is driven by quarterly reporting, and much of that is driven by regulatory requirements. So I'd be curious whether that might be a step we're going to reach as we get towards 2030 and this weather gets worse and worse. I mean, another thing of this Council on Foreign Relations thing yesterday, the prediction about weather, you think it's bad now, and it is bad now. We are headed into really grim weather times, regardless of what targets we hit by 2030. Anyway, I just turned on Dawn Barber's audio, who is a friend of mine and the longtime head of the New York Tech meetup, and somebody smart. I just wanted her to ask any questions she has. Are you there, Dawn?
Yeah, can you hear me, David?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, super interesting. No, I'm always interested in more the sort of, I guess, smaller picture leading to the bigger picture. How important do you guys feel that working with cities and ultimately citizens, I'm constantly in these conversations around, my husband and I are sort of anal compulsive about composting, and for whatever that does, it does a little bit or it doesn't, who knows, we all do our things, and then, like eating beef is really one of the worst things because of the, if you measure the impact and, there's all these measurements. And so, and then, people often say, well, citizens can do whatever, but our little things that we're doing really don't compare to what big companies and big corporations are doing. And that's where really the change has to start. I just be curious what you guys have to say, around that. And basically citizen responsibility and city responsibility to kind of unite with you and unite with us, and let's together something.
Yeah, and you're a credible person to ask that because of all the work you've done with New York City government and how much you know about that. So yeah, any thoughts?
And we've got, in New York, we have this vegan mayor now, but anyway, yeah.
Well, that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Michelle, it's a yes and again, right? It's like, yeah, we had an economist on staff a while ago who was very much like all policy and, individual actions just don't matter. Well, that's bullshit. I just don't agree with that at all, right? This is the kind of culture change we need to have. Individual actions absolutely do make a difference and they do add up. And you really need the policy too, right? You really need cities, you need cities, states. If we didn't have cities and states and companies leading the way for the past few years through the desert of national federal inaction on climate, we would be nowhere. That is not alone, right? It is, again, this positive feedback loop. And I think that, it really ends up being all of those things adding up. I do think it's worth always kind of asking, where do you get the biggest change, right? And that's why, at EDF for my career, I've chosen to work with those leading companies that can drive the big change, because I think that's a really effective way to create big change. In your individual life, what are the things that you can do that will make a big difference? And it ends up being, the kind of transportation you use, how efficient your house is. And it also is, what you eat. If you're going to eat meat, do it in a way that is produced more sustainably and less impact, switching your diet. It's just all a bigger picture of thinking about all the different things you can do to make a difference, and thinking importantly about the things that have the biggest impact. Michelle, what are your thoughts on this?
I think those individual actions make a difference, and I can guarantee you that Microsoft is not the only company that is looking at consumer purchasing behavior. So it is both about how you make a difference for yourself, but it is also about the collective of those signals really being those catalysts of those system changes. I think, for years we've heard that people are willing to pay more for sustainable products. It's just in the past 2 years that it's reached a tipping point. We've actually seen that money move. So in the world that we still live in capitalism, people taking, it's not so much about individual responsibility, because corporate responsibility, I think, far outweighs what any one person should do, but thinking about those individual signals in aggregate, in terms of how that shows up at the ballot place, in terms of what leaders we elect in and what companies you choose to do business with. I can tell you that both public and private sector are paying very close attention to what that looks like.
We're coming towards the end, but I didn't tell her, but I don't know who Judy B is, and if you're willing to speak and tell us who you are. Your question about circular economy, I thought was a really good one, and I'd love you to ask it if you want. Otherwise, I'll just read what you said before. You can talk if you want, Judy B. If I don't hear you talk, I'll just.
Hello, can you, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm not gonna do my video.
That's
can
okay. No, you
now?
can't do video anyway. Don't worry. Just
Okay,
tell
I'm
us who you
sorry.
are and ask your question.
I just finished my workout before the session, so I'm like sweaty and all that.
No,
Well,
I know it's an
anyway.
ambush. I ambushed you, but you did ask a question, so thank you.
We've met during your Techonomy Detroit way back in 2013.
Wonderful. Great.
So anyway, I'm a licensed physical therapist since 1990. And I got into this environmental design because if you guys are familiar with the social determinants of health, I was doing a lot of clinical work and all that. But really, if you want to look at the well-being of a population, it's not just what you do individually, like on the clinic or what kind of medicine. Your environment and your social surroundings has a very huge impact on that. And based on all my healthcare advocacy through being a physical therapist or being the sports athletic director for Special Olympics of Michigan, joining the Hudson's redesign, and being invited as an environmental advisory commission for the city of Warren here in Michigan, I've gotten into you know what? I know there should be specific systems change that we need to do. And I believe as a business owner myself, you cannot really tell the corporations not to grow because then nobody's going to invest in your company.
Yeah.
So 10 years ago, I traveled. Actually, it was just for a seminar for a physical.
We're running low on time, so
I'm sorry. Anyway, I traveled to
economy.
Amsterdam, and they're really big. I found out about the circular economy in Amsterdam 10 years ago. And the EU has a proposal or policy on circular economy. So I just basically, the gist of my question is, how much is circular economy integrated into the sustainability strategy of Microsoft?
Great question. Thank you for that.
Okay,
Yep.
sorry for the big elaboration there.
That's okay. Thank you.
I'll make it quick because I know we're at time, but I think this also popped up in the chat. I think part of that decoupling growth is how do you grow without extraction and production of more materials. So it is integrally related. I think we've had a lot of conversations with sort of business model change of what do consumer packaged goods companies look like if you make tires and you never make tires again, you switch to a lease tire option. I think there are both ways to think about circular economy in terms of materials, which Microsoft is definitely doing, pulling recycled ocean plastics into some of our Xbox controllers, for example, is something that we did about a year ago. So
I'm sure
really
tire makers think about the circular economy. Go ahead. Sorry.
they sure do. I think everybody in that space does that relies on petrochemicals and hard to extract chemicals because of the carbon footprint. And so we're trying to think about both how do we look at alternate materials and then how do we use those materials for a lot longer. And so it is both a science proposition, a technology proposition, but very much at its core, a business model of how do you give people the incentive to still actually make money if they're not producing and selling things anymore, but selling services or selling or monetizing those things on the back end in terms of recycling.
Yeah, we're running out of time, but Elizabeth, any closing thoughts or, you know?
Yeah,
about
thanks,
going
David.
forward?
I appreciate it. I just wanted to end by saying that, I know that you said you're not feeling very hopeful. I mean, I think we are all, we've all at times just been overwhelmed by what we're seeing in this world and this planet, right? And a little freaked out by it. And the truth is, though, we have a choice. Like, we have the time to choose a path to a stable climate, if we so choose right now. And so it does make a difference. And so I really do end up feeling optimistic and energized. The fact that you're tuned into this issue, David, and highlighting it, the fact that Michelle has done the work that she's done at Microsoft, it's really inspiring. And the fact that there's all these youth, all these kids that are going to hold us to account, and there's no other path forward, right? So I really go back to that when it gets so hot here. I should turn off the lights so we don't have rolling blackouts.
Where are you physically right now? In San Francisco?
Yes, in San Francisco. So I really probably actually should turn off my lights.
It's another super hot day.
Another super hot day. They avoided the rolling blackouts though. So yeah, don't have air conditioning here in our apartment.
Oh no. Oh, well,
No.
thank you for coming anyway.
Yes.
You seem cool and collected. Thank you, Michelle, so much. And thank you to Microsoft for being the company you are. And thank you to EDF for being the organization you are. And please, everyone, come to the Health and Wealth of Our Planet, September 20th, 2 weeks from yesterday, here in New York at City Winery. Here, Elizabeth to go in more detail about the work she's done. And we'll see you. We have another session a week from tomorrow on climate tech startups. So that'll be at 1 o'clock on Thursday of next week. And we hope you'll all join us for there. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for everybody being here, and particularly to Elizabeth and Michelle.
Thanks,
Have a great
David.
Thank you. Bye-bye.